Apple, the world's most recognizable brand and the first company ever worth $3 trillion. But how did it get here? Why is Apple so successful? Now you might be thinking, that's obvious, the iPhone. But you're only half right. Yes, the iPhone was groundbreaking, no question. But here's the thing. Apple was already on a roll by the time Steve Jobs unveiled it in 2007. The real turning point happened years earlier, a different product launch, a day that almost no one talks about anymore. I spent some time looking at the financials, and what I found was really interesting. There's a moment in Apple's history where the trajectory changed. You can pinpoint exactly when the company stopped struggling to survive and began its rapid climb to becoming a global powerhouse. This is the story, the mostly forgotten story of the day Apple truly turned it all around. And it's probably not what you think. But first, for context, we have to go back to the 1990s, a decade when Apple was, well, an afterthought. People remembered Apple computers from the 1980s. Maybe they played Oregon Trail on their Apple II, or they remembered the original Macintosh. But by the mid-90s, hardly anyone still owned an Apple computer. Bill Gates had won the computer wars. PCs dominated the market, and whether you owned a Dell, a Compaq, or a Gateway, when you booted it up, it ran Windows. By 1997, Microsoft held over a 90% market share. Apple, just 3%, mostly in niche markets like graphic design and publishing. Steve Jobs, the man who co-founded Apple, he'd been gone for over a decade, and to many, he was seen as a has-been whose moment had passed. In fact, there was an interesting made-for-TV movie that came out in the late 1990s called The Pirates of Silicon Valley. It was fun to watch, but in that movie, Steve Jobs was depicted as a brilliant but beaten rival, overshadowed by Bill Gates.
We're better than you are.
That doesn't matter.
Meanwhile, Apple's products weren't exactly awe-inspiring. The PowerBook 5300 was a disaster. The Apple Newton PDA was mostly a joke. The company was losing money fast. 1997 was a particularly interesting year. Apple lost $1 billion and was on the verge of bankruptcy. Microsoft actually bailed out the company by investing $150 million to keep it afloat. Also in 97, Steve Jobs returned to the company, but remember, he wasn't yet the mythic genius we think of today. Analysts openly questioned if Apple would even survive. In fact, Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, famously said that if he ran Apple, he would shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. Steve Jobs did start to change some things. He simplified Apple's product line and successfully launched the iMac. And Apple turned a profit in 98 and 99 during the dot-com boom. But even though the company was improving, its valuation wasn't even in the same league as the major tech companies of that era. Meanwhile, another industry was imploding. In 1999, a little program called Napster became the hottest thing on the internet. For the first time, millions of people could share and download music files instantly for free. Napster didn't just disrupt the music business, it fractured it. CD sales plummeted. The big record labels, Universal, Sony, Warner, they panicked and sued Napster into the ground.
A federal court ruled Monday Napster must stop allowing music fans to swap copyrighted material.
But by then, the genie was out of the bottle. People had learned that music could live on a computer, and they didn't have to pay $18 for a CD anymore. Even after Napster was shut down, piracy thrived. Programs like LimeWire and BitTorrent made it easy to download songs and burn your own CDs. And at the same time, the first MP3 players started to emerge. Most were clunky and hard to use. You had to worry about file formats, directories, and compatibility. That's when Steve Jobs, a music lover himself, saw an opening. In fall of 2001, Apple released the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Now you might be thinking, oh yeah, I remember the iPod. That must have been when Apple turned it around. Well, not exactly. Apple sold 376,000 iPods the first year. And that sounds pretty good, but just for perspective, today, Apple sells about twice that many iPhones every single day. So there were some problems with those early iPods. First, you had to sync it with a Mac computer. And in 2002, less than 3% of people owned a Mac. So even though the iPod looked like an awesome product, it wasn't even an option for most people. Second, getting songs from your CD onto the iPod was clunky. And remember, most people had a hodgepodge of music files, along with pirated MP3s. Digital music was really a mess back then. Steve Jobs realized the iPod needed an ecosystem, a seamless, legitimate way for people to buy music online. And that meant doing the impossible, convincing the fractured, paranoid record industry to put their catalogs on a single platform, run by Apple. Throughout 2002, Jobs personally negotiated with the record labels. He got all the major labels on board, but there was one holdout. It was Sony, who was both a record label and a consumer electronics brand. And there's a story within a story here. Sony really missed a huge opportunity. They should have been the company to dominate digital music. Think about it. They had the electronics division, and they were the original creators of the Walkman and the Discman. And they also had the record label, Sony Music, with a massive catalog. They could have easily convinced other labels to go along with them. But Sony's internal divisions were very independent from one another. They were each looking out for themselves. The music side and the electronics side never collaborated. Sony's head of music, a guy named Andy Lack, knew exactly what Steve Jobs was trying to do. He resisted, pushed for royalties, and negotiated hard with Steve Jobs. But it was too late. The other labels wanted to go with Apple. And that's an important lesson. Even a company like Sony, who already owned all the pieces of the puzzle, can miss a transformational opportunity if they can't get their own house in order. Steve Jobs had fewer resources, but he had a vision and his company knew how to execute. Eventually, Sony signed on and allowed Apple to use their music catalog. Now with the record labels signed on, things were starting to fall into place. But many of the top music artists had specific contract carve-outs, and Jobs had to convince them to sign on as well. He met individually with dozens of artists, including Bono, Mick Jagger, Sheryl Crow, and others, to win support for legal downloads. The promise was simple. Apple would make it easier for people to buy music than to steal music. On April 28, 2003, Steve Jobs took the stage and unveiled the iTunes Music Store. For the first time, you could buy individual songs online for just 99 cents and instantly download them to your computer and then sync them to your iPod. It was legal, all really simple. It could be done with just one click. No piracy, no more messy software.
And when you look at this, Apple is the first company that's brought together the entire ecosystem for the new digital age of music.
Steve Jobs also introduced a new version of the iPod. And this new version had a 30-pin USB connector instead of a FireWire, meaning it could finally connect with Windows PCs. During his presentation, he also announced the iTunes Store would soon launch on Windows. Suddenly, Apple's products weren't just for Mac users, they were for everyone. And that's what did it for me. Soon after the announcement, I went out and bought my first ever Apple product, this third generation iPod, and immediately fell in love with it. Some of Apple's competitors were stunned by the announcement. Microsoft was still trying to figure out their online digital strategy at this time. And that night, several executives bounced an email around. One of them wrote, "How did they get the music companies to go along?" Another replied, "We're smoked." Bill Gates himself then chimed in, "Jobs has us a bit flat-footed again." The results of the iTunes Music Store were immediate. 1 million songs sold in the first week. And the iPod exploded in popularity. Sales tripled in 2003 and then quadrupled in 2004. By 2006, Apple was selling 40 million iPods per year. And in less than 3 years, they had sold over 1 billion songs. And this all reflected in the financials. In 2005, the company posted a record $1.3 billion in net income. And then they beat that record the following year, and then every year for 9 consecutive years. Apple's valuation, which had always averaged about $5 billion from 1990 through 2003, it skyrocketed. And by 2007, Apple's market cap had climbed to over $60 billion. That's 12 times more than it was just 4 years earlier. Meanwhile, the competitors, they all scrambled. Dell launched an MP3 player. And then Microsoft tried to find its way into the market and launched a product called Zune in November of 2006. But by then, Apple was just weeks away from introducing the iPhone. The competition never stood a chance. The numbers clearly show that the launch of the iTunes Music Store was the turning point. The resulting iPod sales catapulted Apple into orbit. And then the iPhone eventually took Apple to the moon.
iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
With the iPhone's release in 2007, Apple's momentum became unstoppable. Its market cap and product sales skyrocketed throughout the 2010s. The company eventually discontinued the iPod, but marched forward with the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch, and more. And it all traces back to the ecosystem strategy that began in the spring of 2003. Without iTunes Music, there's no iPod dominance. Without the iPod dominance, people aren't in Apple's ecosystem, and there's no natural path to the iPhone. Without the iPhone, Apple is not the company that we know today. April 28, 2003 is where everything changed. It was the day Apple transformed from a niche computer maker into the world's most influential technology company. The day Apple learned to control not just the device in your hand, but the entire experience around it. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And also, tell me, what do you think? Do you remember burning CDs? Do you remember using Napster? Did you own an iPod? And do you remember buying songs from the iTunes Music Store? Leave a comment below. I would love to hear. As always, thank you for watching.